The first thing Mira noticed about the Veth was that they had no word for performance. She learned this 3 weeks into the occupation, when Commander Osh Vereth walked through the corridors of the Krakow Cultural Preservation Facility. What the residents still called the house, because old habits resist the end of the world, and asked the warden, through the translation collar at his throat, what the humans inside were doing. They rehearse, the warden said. The collar hummed. The Veth's bioluminescent fringe pulsed once, pale amber. They prepare to deceive? Osh Vereth asked. The warden was a young man, 26, recent graduate. He had been doing very well at keeping his hands still. They prepare to perform, to tell a story in front of others, on a stage. Another pulse, longer this time. To what end? He didn't have an answer for that. Neither, it turned out, did anyone at Veth High Command. They filed the activity under non-threatening cultural repetition and moved on to the business of dismantling the power grid. Inside, the house smelled of pine resin and old fabric, and something medicinal that no one ever identified. 41 former actors lived there, some retired, some simply forgotten by an industry that had moved on without them. The youngest was 68. The eldest, a woman named Helena who had played Ophelia in Warsaw in 1973, was 91 and still corrected everyone's vowels. They had been told, via the same translation collars fitted to every remaining civic administrator, that they were not to be disturbed. The Veth had no interest in the elderly or the non-productive. This was not mercy, it was accounting. Jersey arrived on a Tuesday 2 weeks after the occupation began. He came in a Veth-permitted vehicle, one of the last ground transports still running, with a battered leather bag over one shoulder and a bottle of something that was definitely not water in his coat pocket. He was 73, built like a man who had once been large and had decided to stay that way out of stubbornness. His face was a map of every role he had ever played. The general, the drunk, the grieving father, the one who survives when everyone around him does not. He had been the most famous actor in the country once. He was the most famous actor in the country still, though the country had shrunk to fit inside these walls, more or less. Helena met him at the door. She looked him up and down the way she had been looking people up and down since before he was born. "You look terrible," she said. "You look exactly the same," he said. "I know." She stepped aside. "Come in before one of their flyers clocks you on the street." He came in. He set his bag down in the room they gave him, which smelled of lavender and someone else's grief. He stood at the window for a long time, looking at the city, at the lattice of pale Veth signal towers that now crisscrossed the skyline like a second architecture imposed over the first. And he did something that nobody saw. He pressed his forehead against the glass and closed his eyes. Then he opened them, turned around, went to find whoever was in charge of the rehearsal space. The Veth had a theory about human cultural production, which they had developed from 3 days of satellite band interception and a brief consultation with their xenosociology division. The theory held that human performance was a form of communal information processing, a primitive method of transmitting behavioral data through narrative simulation. Useful once, no longer necessary, given superior information architecture. The Veth had made this transition 40,000 years ago and had no nostalgia for the period before it. They found the human attachment to live storytelling neither charming nor threatening. They found it inefficient, the way one finds a sundial inefficient, quaint, irrelevant. This was their first miscalculation. Their second was allowing the performances to continue. Jersey had brought a copy of Faust, not a digital copy, an actual book, worn at the spine, annotated in 3 different inks spanning perhaps 40 years of engagement with the text. He set it on the table in the common room and looked around at the faces assembled there. 23 of the 41 residents, the ones who could still move without too much difficulty, plus 4 who could not move easily, but had come anyway, and were sitting in the back with the quiet authority of people who have survived worse than inconvenience. "We're going to perform this," he said. Silence. "The whole thing?" asked Roman, a character actor of considerable reputation who had spent the last 2 weeks sitting by the window reading the same detective novel for the 4th time. Excerpts. Enough to be a show. 2 hours, maybe 2.5. "For whom?" said Wanda, who had been the greatest Medea of her generation and now had arthritis in both hands and the same clear, devastating eyes she'd had at 30. "There's no audience. They've restricted public assembly." Jersey looked at her. "There's always an audience," he said. "We'll find one." Mira was there because she worked there. She was one of the 3 remaining staff members, 29 years old, trained as a cultural archivist. currently serving as cook, nurse, general coordinator, and occasional emotional support for 41 people, navigating the end of the world as they had known it. She had stayed because leaving felt impossible, and also because these people needed someone who could operate the medication dispensary. She heard his answer and thought, this man is going to get us all killed. She also thought, almost simultaneously, I want to see what happens. The rehearsals began the following morning. Mira watched them from the doorway of the rehearsal room, which was a large space on the ground floor that had been a performance hall once, and now held folding chairs, 2 broken spotlights, and a smell of old wood and ambition. She watched Jersey move through the space with a physical confidence that seemed wrong for a man his age. Wrong, and then suddenly exactly right, because she understood that this was the only place on Earth where he still knew precisely who he was and what his body was for. Helena took the role of Faust without being asked. This was correct, and everyone knew it. She sat in a chair at center stage because standing for long was difficult, and she delivered the opening monologue in a voice that seemed to come from somewhere below the floor, resonant and certain, and the room was absolutely silent. Roman played Mephistopheles. He had been born to play Mephistopheles, and the role fit him the way old shoes fit, without effort, with total precision. He moved through the space with a particular loose-limbed ease, and when he smiled, it was a smile that made you feel you should check your pockets. They cast others. They improvised. They argued for 40 minutes about the staging of a particular scene, and then Helena said something very quiet, and everyone stopped arguing and they staged it her way, which was the right way. Mira stopped watching from the doorway. She sat down. Oshvareth returned to the facility on a Wednesday. This was logged as a routine welfare audit, a category the Veth had developed for locations housing non-productive humans, mostly the very old and the very young, whom they had classified as outside the immediate scope of labor reallocation. The audit was meant to take 20 minutes. It took considerably longer. The commander stood in the corridor outside the rehearsal room and listened. Helena's voice came through the door. She was mid-speech. Faust's great monologue of despair, the one where he catalogues everything he has learned and finds it insufficient, where he stands at the edge of all human knowledge and sees only darkness beyond it, and yet still does not jump. The voice was not performing the emotion. It was containing it, the way stone contains water, the pressure visible in every word. The translation collar at Oshvareth's throat was not designed for theatrical verse. It rendered fragments. But something in the sound itself, the frequency, the weight of it, the deliberate human architecture of breath and pause, moved through the door and into the corridor and into whatever Veth's sensory apparatus processed such things, and Oshvareth stood very still. A junior officer touched his arm. "Commander, the audit." "A moment," Oshvareth said. The moment lasted 11 minutes. There was a prison on the edge of the city. Jersey found out about it the way you find out about things during occupations, through the gaps between official information, through a word exchanged during the permitted hour of outdoor movement, through Mira, who had family contacts in the civic administration, and had heard that the Veth were holding approximately 800 people in the facility, a detention pending classification, which was what the Veth called it when they hadn't yet decided what to do with you. He sat with this information for 2 days. He did not discuss it in rehearsal. He kept working. On the 3rd day, he went to find Mira. She was in the kitchen, which smelled of weak broth and something approximating bread. She was moving with the economical efficiency of someone who has learned to do a great deal with very little, and she was humming something he didn't recognize. Low, under her breath, not quite a song. He said, "I want to perform there, at the prison." She set down some she was holding. She turned around. She looked at him with an expression he recognized. He'd worn it himself, in a different life, looking at a director who had just proposed something impossible and necessary. "They won't allow a public assembly," she said. "It wouldn't be public, it would be for detainees. Cultural programming. The Veth have no specific prohibition on cultural programming for the detained population. I've read their standing orders 3 times. You read their standing orders." "I had time." He paused. "They don't understand what theater is. They think it's information transmission. We go in, we tell people a story, we leave. They don't see the danger in it." "What is the danger in it?" He was quiet for a moment. The kitchen was small and warm, and outside the window, the signal towers blinked their cold light against the late afternoon sky. "It reminds people," he said, "that they are people." The permission came through in 4 days. Oshvareth signed it personally. His notation in the Veth administrative record described it as an experiment in observing non-productive cultural transmission among a captive population. He was interested in the data. This was true. It was also not the whole truth. The commander had gone back to stand outside the rehearsal room twice more since that first Wednesday. They arrived at the facility on a Friday morning, 11 actors, Mira with a bag of props, and the 2 working spotlights loaded into a cart. The Veth guards at the entrance processed them with the thoroughness of entities who did not understand what they were looking at, and were therefore slightly suspicious of all of it. One of them confiscated a walking stick, decided it was a weapon, was gently corrected by Mira, returned the walking stick. They were given an hour to set up in the facility's assembly hall. The detainees were brought in under guard. 800 people in a room built for 500. They sat on the floor where there were no chairs. They looked at the stage, 2 portable lights, a strip of open floor, a woman in her 90s sitting in a wooden chair with the composure of a mountain, and something moved through the room that had not been there before. It is very difficult to describe. It was not hope exactly, though it was adjacent to hope. It was the specific gravity of recognition, the sense that someone in the front of a room was about to acknowledge something true, something that the official architecture of the occupation had been carefully constructed to make unacknowledgeable. Helena raised her head. She began. Jersey watched from the wings. He had done this before, stood in the wings while someone else held a room. He knew what it looked like when it was working. The stillness in an audience is not absence. It is presence, specifically directed. When a room of 800 people stops making noise not because they are afraid, but because they do not want to miss anything. That is a different quality of silence altogether. And it has a weight, and it presses against you like warm water. 800 people stopped. Helena's voice moved through the room. Faust's despair, Faust's bargain. Faust's long, catastrophic human insistence on reaching for what lies beyond reach. Not because he expects to grasp it, but because the reaching itself is what he is. Roman's Mephistopheles coiled around her, precisely calibrated, offering everything the human heart desires with the faint smile of someone who knows exactly what accepting will cost. The old game. Older than Goethe, older than writing. Mira stood in the back of the hall and found that she was crying without knowing she had started. She looked around. She was not alone in this. She looked at the Veth guards stationed along the walls, their bioluminescent fringe pulsing in patterns she had learned, a little, to read. She did not know enough to be sure, but the patterns looked different from their standard patterns. Less regular, something slightly disrupted. She thought, they can tell something is happening. They just don't know what it is. 3 weeks after the prison performance, HFY submitted a formal request to Veth High Command. The request was for a modification to the cultural assessment protocol. Specifically, he requested that live human theatrical performance be reclassified from non-threatening cultural repetition to unclassified potential cultural variable, which, in Veth administrative terms, meant that it required more study before any decisions about it could be made. Practically speaking, this meant no restrictions and an assignment for his unit to observe and document. High Command approved the request. They were busy with the power grid. What HFY wrote in his private log, a format the Veth used for observations that did not fit existing analytical categories, was this. The human performance creates a state in its witnesses that resembles but is not identical to information transfer. What is transmitted appears to be something more like orientation. The witnesses, upon receiving it, seem to know more clearly where they stand in relation to each other, and to something that preceded the current conditions, and to something they apparently still expect to follow from them. I do not have a framework for what this orientation does to a population's capacity for sustained function under adverse conditions. I intend to continue observing. This was his third miscalculation, though it was also the closest he had come to understanding. They performed in the prison 3 more times over the following months. They performed twice, in the house itself, for the residents who could not travel, for the staff, for 2 Veth officers who appeared at the door and were given seats in the back without comment. They began teaching. Wanda led movement workshops for anyone who wanted them, which eventually included several of the younger Veth administration translators, who came in civilian clothes and sat in the back and said nothing, and came back the following week. Helena at 91 was learning a new scene. Mira found her at it one morning, sitting by the window with the annotated Faust open on her lap, mouthing the words to herself, and Mira sat down across from her and watched. Are you afraid, Mira asked, meaning, of everything, of all of it, of the occupation and the uncertain future and the cold and the shortages and the question of what comes next? Helena looked up from the book. Her eyes were clear and extraordinarily dark. I have been afraid before, she said. It doesn't stop the work. She looked back down at the page, her lips moved. She was somewhere else entirely, in Goethe's century, or in the infinite stage of the text itself, or in some place beyond both where the specific gravity of human longing remains constant, regardless of who is doing the longing or under what sky. Mira sat with her and did not speak. Outside, a Veth flyer passed low over the city, its running lights cold and blue against the evening. Inside, the pine resin and old fabric and something medicinal. Inside, a woman at 91 learning her lines. The title of the play they had chosen meant, roughly, Before the devil knows you're dead. Before everything has been decided. Before the last light fails, there was still time. There would be more performances. The audience was still out there, waiting in the dark of the hall for the lights to come up. And the lights would come up. And someone would walk out onto the stage and open their mouth, and the first word would fall into the silence like a stone. Into still water, and the ripples would move, outward, and outward, and outward. And the Veth, with all their superior information architecture, had no instrument designed to measure where those ripples ended. Jersey stood in the wings, as he always stood in the wings, and watched the room fill. He reached into his coat pocket and found the bottle that was definitely not water. He took a pull from it. He passed it to Roman, who took a pull without looking away from the stage. Helena raised her head. She began. Linda led movement workshops for anyone who wanted them, which eventually included several of the younger Veth administration translators, who came in civilian clothes and sat in the back and said nothing, and came back the following week. Helena at 91 was learning a new scene. Mira found her at it one morning, sitting by the window with the annotated Faust open on her lap, mouthing the words to herself, and Mira sat down across from her and watched. Are you afraid, Mira asked, meaning, of everything, of all of it, of the occupation and the uncertain future and the cold and the shortages and the question of what comes next? Helena looked up from the book. Her eyes were clear and extraordinarily dark. I have been afraid before, she said. It doesn't stop the work. She looked back down at the page, her lips moved. She was somewhere else entirely, in Goethe's century, or in the infinite stage of the text itself, or in some place beyond both where the specific gravity of human longing remains constant, regardless of who is doing the longing or under what sky. Mira sat with her and did not speak. Outside, a Veth flyer passed low over the city, its running lights cold and blue against the evening. Inside, the pine resin and old fabric and something medicinal. Inside, a woman at 91 learning her lines. The title of the play they had chosen meant, roughly, Before the devil knows you're dead. Before everything has been decided. Before the last light fails, there was still time. There would be more performances. The audience was still out there, waiting in the dark of the hall for the lights to come up. And the lights would come up. And someone would walk out onto the stage and open their mouth, and the first word would fall into the silence like a stone. Into still water, and the ripples would move, outward, and outward, and outward. Specific gravity of human longing remains constant, regardless of who is doing the longing or under what sky. Mira sat with her and did not speak. Outside, a Veth flyer passed low over the city, its running lights cold and blue against the evening. Inside, the pine resin and old fabric and something medicinal. Inside, a woman at 91 learning her lines. The title of the play they had chosen meant, roughly, Before the devil knows you're dead. Before everything has been decided. Before the last light fails, there was still time. There would be more performances. The audience was still out there, waiting in the dark of the hall for the lights to come up. And the lights would come up. And someone would walk out onto the stage and open their mouth, and the first word would fall into the silence like a stone. Into still water, and the ripples would move, outward, and outward, and outward. And the Veth, with all their superior information architecture, had no instrument designed to measure where those ripples ended. Jersey stood in the wings, as he always stood in the wings, and watched the room fill. He reached into his coat pocket and found the bottle that was definitely not water. He took a pull from it. He passed it to Roman, who took a pull without looking away from the stage. Helena raised her head. She began.